deal with chapter 13, which is entitled Aurora. And so, like, the music for this song, I wrote literally like a decade ago, I think. It's probably been around a decade. Um, and it's pretty simple. So, like, I remember a couple of my friends on like Friday nights, shout out to Becky and Chris. Um, they used to do this like Bible study fellowship kind of small group sort of thing at their house. And this particular Friday night, I brought my acoustic guitar over. I think they asked me to play a couple of songs or something like that, for like praise and worship in their living room. And I ended up just kind of hanging out in the living room afterwards, and a lot of people were just hanging out in the kitchen and talking and everything. And I guess I was being kind of antisocial or something. Uh, but I was just jamming on my guitar, put like a capo on third fret or something like that, and this song, the music just came out. Um, which my acoustic guitar is a 12 string. I don't actually own like a 6 string acoustic guitar. I prefer electric guitar over anything else, but around that time I found like a pretty sweet deal on a 12 string. So it was definitely a song that I wanted to incorporate that 12 string on. And I mean the progressions throughout, I mean it's basically the same progression through the entire song minus like the ending riff or whatever. Um but I wanted to do some like variations on it. So I mean it has more like a acoustic and hard rock vibe, like the first two verses or so, and then kind of becomes metalcore, and then the like fourth verse is, I don't know, it's not really deathcore. It has this like descendo sort of thing where it just kind of becomes doom metally, um, and it's just open kind of chugs, but on like also just kind of bending the note for like my sixth string, or yeah, I guess my sixth string, just kind of bending it where in the same progression of this descending kind of chord structure. So it's not like a super complicated song at all, but personally, I think it's effective enough. And I had fun recording it, so that's kind of all that matters to me when it comes to that. Um, so, like the literal meaning of what's going on in this, world is that after the whole like mausoleums, uh, yeah, cemetery sort of thing, the protagonist journeys forth and comes across this village. As I've traveled overseas a number of times, South America and uh, in Central America and all too. So like village to me has sort of this implication of grass huts and dirt floors and stuff like that. And, maybe it is something along those lines, or maybe it's just a small community in the United States or some other Western European sort of thing going on. But it's just no matter like if you want to think of it as being third world or whether it's first or second world, or like, it doesn't matter. Um, it's just a village, you know, this small community. And he arrives there and pretty much stays for X amount of time. And because, like, he has, you know, the military past, and, you know, like, he's considered extremely smart among the villagers. And they're kind of amazed by him and whatnot. And, you know, he kind of gets a sense of pride from that, I suppose. But once he's kind of been there a while, they pretty much come to him and say, you know, there's essentially the myth of the Sleeping Beauty is going on inside this village. There's this comatose lady who's been asleep for a very long time. I mean, doesn't matter if it's been a couple of weeks, months, years, whatever. It's she's been there just asleep. And I mean, I suppose this is where it becomes monomythic, and we're dealing with, um, I mean, even kind of like a Disney vibe sort of thing, since, you know, Sleeping Beauty is a story, you know, is obviously made into a cartoon movie back in, I can't remember exactly what decade that was, but, you know, it's an old Disney film. Pretty much, I think everybody has seen it at some point. Um, but, you know, the of course, Disney movies are pretty much coming from some sort of literary background. You know, The Little Mermaid, for instance, was a novel that was kind of vastly different, especially with the ending, and very much more depressing than, you know, the actual like film version from the late 80s. Um, and, you know, it's no different with the Sleeping Beauty, you know, that's coming from like Germanic myth. And I'm pretty sure like it's included in Grimm's fairy tales and stuff like that. So there's a number of different lines in it that, you know, say, you know, yeah, the Sleeping Beauty myth, um, but also she's also known as the Little Briar Rose, you know, this maiden, or um, there's reference to Maleficent and the curse. And I entitled it Aurora because of like reference to Disney. You know, she's known as Princess Aurora in the film, which also I recognize maybe more now than at the time that I wrote this, that Aurora is also like reference to Greek mythos. Um, you know, Aurora is considered the goddess of the dawn. But also, hey, going back to the Arctic Circle chapter, you know, there's reference in there to the Aurora Borealis. So it's kind of, you know, there's some ties in with all that stuff. And, you know, I don't necessarily want to give the implication that this is some sleeping goddess or anything like that. But I do think the idea of being this goddess of the dawn sort of ties in with it loosely. Um, but what happens in the literal interpretation of this story is that he's brought to this sleeping beauty and instantly kind of just sees her and falls in love like that. It's just one of those sort of things. Um, so, like, to read out some of the different lines, In going back into some of the chapters that are more like politically motivated, the character says, I wanted to rage against contrivance, warn of politicians, tax collectors, tyrants young and old, richer or poorer. So, like, the richer or poorer obviously has this, like, wedding language to it. Tyrants young and old, going back to the politics stuff. Tax collectors, uh, reference to, the New Testament Gospels and how, Roman tax collectors were seen as pretty much the scum of the earth to, the early Jews. Um, and just, I wanted to rage against contrivance of just having this sort of reactionary or maybe even revolutionary sort of um, idea about him. Um, but then he also says, they say I'm a genius when I arrive at the village. His thought processing and certain amounts of knowledge, which, personally, I've had maybe a few handfuls of people over the years say, Ben, you're a genius, or, you're on a cognitive level that's, above, whatever, which I don't consider myself a genius, maybe above average, but definitely not a genius. But, you know, heck, I remember years and years and years ago, when I was like still in high school, this other woman that I ended up sort of wanting to spend my life with. Um, she once told me, that she considered me the smartest person she knew. And it was because I had made some comment that, I thought I was stupid or I said something stupid. And she was like, no, no, you're smartest. And she made it her point to like take, like drag me to other people and ask, like, how smart do you think Ben is and stuff like that. So, I think this has a lot of personal meaning, is essentially what I'm trying to say here. That in some ways, I guess it is autobiographical to kind of how I view myself in some ways. Um, the choruses for this song um, are like variations of phrasing, um, but they all um, pretty much point to the idea of, like it says in the first chorus, but nothing truly mattered until I beheld her face. And it's essentially the protagonist, me, whatever you want to, whichever voice you think is more dominant here, whether it's me or the protagonist, saying, listing out different, views of self or like perceptions of other views of this character. Um, and then kind of realizing like none of that stuff really matters because now I see her, you know, that's she's all that matters at this point. Um, so yeah, second verse, I'd heard the Sleeping Beauty myth, the Little Briar Rose Maiden. How could I have known her resting place was in this village? That folklore was reality. And I mean, obviously, um, magic, it's, fantasy or whatever, but in this world, it's still this like rationalism, much like our own world. But here he comes across something that is seemingly impossible, that there's this woman who's been comatose basically because of like a maleficent figure's curse. Um, and so he says, I was the genius, never a prince, only caring about philosophy. Just, you know, personal to me is, um, okay, so I accept that a lot of other people think I'm a genius, but I'm not like prince or royalty or anything like that. And really, at the end of the day, what do I care about, but just some sort of rational philosophy of, and me writing that's kind of reference to maybe the nihilistic period of my life that I've kind of referenced, or maybe even like coming out of that, of just like, I've got to figure things out and formulate some sort of philosophy of life. And that no longer mattered, like the chorus says, because I beheld her face. Um, and so, like the third verse, he says, it was always happily ever after, move onward, find another purpose. So, continually going on this journey. Um, but he says, in this village, I know why I'm here. Feet guided to tell how she's his bride. Skylit even during nightfall. And biblical reference at the end of this verse, go away, for the girl is not dead but sleeping. So, like, that pretty much means that the villagers have kind of accepted that maybe she's just dead, but he's like, no, she's just sleeping. Um, and when it says, feet guided to tell how she's his bride, that's kind of like a direct reference of what this Aurora figure actually represents is the church. Um, so, I mean, I have been a part of, I guess, few different denominations, but I grew up Methodist up until really around the time my brother was born. So I was, really little, like third grade, fourth grade, somewhere in there. Yeah, like third grade. Um, and I've said this to people in the past that Christianity never made sense to me as a kid. It was just, I never understood why this Jesus guy died on a cross and why there was this cross like in front of the church. Like, no one really ever took the time to explain that stuff to me. It wasn't until I was in middle school when we started attending a Baptist church that the whole, reason for the, life, death, burial, resurrection, all that, um, was explained to me, and, in simple terms. But when, especially when I was taking, it was like an early church history course, like my fourth year in college. Um, so my professor for that class was Catholic, but he was like a charismatic Catholic guy. It was pretty interesting um, to think of it like he was legit like part of Catholicism, but also like was a charismatic. But anyway, like, I'm not gonna pretend like at the time I was that interested in studying early church history, because I wasn't. Like, I don't remember a very much of what we studied, but I do remember a few key concepts. And I remember that semester when I was in that class going through all the different church fathers and um like, I mean, from like the early apostles to essentially like St. Augustine was kind of where we, you know, fell into the history course. Um, there were two things that seemed to consistently come up in the like textbook reading and in the lectures and everything, and those two things were Eucharist and baptism. And I believe I remember him like really saying like they the early church fathers wanted to really hammer down and define this stuff because they realized like how important these sacraments are. That and he pretty much told us like these sacraments are so important because they unite all of Christendom, um, regardless of culture, um, the time you know a person lives in, whether it's medieval times, whether it's um, early church times, whether it's postmodern times, like doesn't matter. It literally is this thing that everybody does, and it unites everybody. When you take the bread and wine or grape juice, it means that you're practicing this thing that people did 1900 years ago, 2000 years ago, that this is something that truly matters. And so I remember after, like maybe a couple of weeks after that lecture, I think like one of my roommates or something at the time, we went, we wanted to go like visit some church or whatever. And it was, like a local Methodist church not too far from the university. And I was kind of apprehensive about it at the time because I was like, I grew up Methodist and I don't have a lot of respect for that denomination. But like we got there and it was a decent enough service, but it was like at the end we all took Eucharist. And I remember like standing there and was like this this matters, whether you want to think of like transubstantiation of, oh, it becomes literal flesh and blood, or whether it's purely symbolic. It's still, either way, unites us with all of Christendom, and just kind of being overwhelmed by that idea that this this means something. This is, yeah, even in like weddings, you'll see people take Eucharist and stuff like that. Like this is essentially like wedding language. And so I don't know, like I say all this because things like that help me to recognize like how important the idea of the church universal truly is. The bride, whatever language you want to call this universal church, it matters. It is real. Um, that it is supposed to unite everyone under the banner of Jesus, of His kingdom. That we're all part of something greater than ourselves. Um, and it going through like I don't remember it now, but I remember part of the final exam was he pretty much made us memorize um, the Athanasian Creed. Yeah, and I mean it's much longer than the Apostles' Creed, but uh, at the same time, like it kind of, they're kind of the same. They make the same um, the same like beliefs that's supposed to unite all of Christendom. And something like my mom used to instill when I was younger was, the idea within the Apostles' Creed of, the I believe in the Holy Catholic Church, which, Catholicism, like Roman Catholicism, we say Catholic now and we just associate it with that. But the word Catholic literally means universal. And so the Holy Catholic Church in the creeds is reference to the bride, to this universal, the church universal. And so like back then seeing that just made me have this deep appreciation for this universal concept. And that's what this song is about. That's who Aurora is supposed to represent. Now, I'm not going to lie, me personally, this being kind of autobiographical, seeing her face like in the choruses references the church, but it also references different women that I wanted to marry. And, so far in my life, there's been like four that I was like, I that's her. That's the one if there is a one. You know, um, and it's like every time you kind of like see this person and you're like, all that other crap from the past that gave me so much anxiety and so much depression and so much like, yeah, it's in the past now. Like none of that shit matters. Excuse the French. None of it matters because now I see her. And of course, me writing it at that time, yeah, it is kind of referencing that fourth woman that I wanted to marry at the time. Um, I mean, I definitely must give my disclaimer that this really isn't about her, but definitely written kind of because of her. Because at that point in time, it was like all I really did care about was philosophy and stuff like that. And then I met her and fell pretty hard. And I was like, yeah, none of that stuff matters. Those other women that I was all about in the past, yeah, none of them matter anymore. She's eclipsed them, so to speak. And so at that point, it was like all that mattered was to me was her. So I mean, I wrote this because of her. Um, but where this myth deviates from the Sleeping Beauty narrative is that what causes the princess to wake up? Well, she gets kissed by the handsome prince, right? Well, he says in this that I never had a chance to kiss, but she awakens with a beauty disarming my every defense, and that's how it ends. The magic of it isn't that he kisses her and it's a cause and effect sort of thing. She just naturally wakes up and he just so happens to be like standing right in front of her and sees like her beauty. And of course, that can be like physical beauty, but we're talking about something much deeper, emotional, spiritual, psychological, like the whole spectrum of beauty. And just like this universal idea of beauty and aesthetics that just all kind of correlates to her. She's like the pinnacle of that to the protagonist. And I guess I don't say it directly in this song, but I mean, the Sleeping Beauty idea, the myth or whatever you want to call it, um, focuses on the the female, the princess, the fair maiden is the one who awakens, right? I mean that's what we know. Excuse me. And it's because of like the prince kissing her or whatever, and just this love sort of thing. But he doesn't kiss her at all. She awakens anyway. And really, what happens here, and what I wanted to point out in between the lines, is that just as important is the fact that something in the protagonist has awakened. And that's how it was with me, was, just the whole idea of like all I cared about was aesthetics and philosophy and just being the smartest guy in the room if I could be. And now she's here and none of that matters. And that's because something has awakened in here. And maybe it's his instant love for her that, you know, wakes her up. And, you could interpret it that way. But I think it's just important to point out that it's not just that she wakes up, but he wakes up too.